Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for being here. Welcome to our critical review of Switzerland's environmental and energy policies and their impact on housing inequalities. My name is Jennifer Deine. I'm the director of the ETH Centre for Research on Architecture, Society and the Built Environment. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Hannah Wittmer, who is working together with me and other colleagues who cannot be here today on this very exciting research project. But let's start also. Before starting, I would like to thank our colleagues from the University of Vienna for giving us this opportunity to be here today and to share with all of you our experience and our research findings, our preliminary research findings, I should say. Well, first of all, let me give you a brief overview of what we are going to discuss today. I will start by giving you a short background information about this research project, the research project on contextualized pathways for reducing housing inequalities. It's a very large research project that we are doing together with a big group of researchers from several countries. I will come back to that later. And we will then tell you something about the context of Switzerland. The name of the project is Contextualized Pathways to Reduce Housing Inequalities, which also emphasizes the importance of contextualizing, of understanding the context in which transformations and energy and environmental policies, but also housing systems are emerging. I will then give you a brief introduction about the environmental and energy policies in Switzerland, and then I will pass the word to my colleague Hannah Wittmer, who will present you some case studies from the city of Zurich, which are very clearly will illustrate what actually happens in specific contexts with regard to the implementation of some specific environmental and energy policies. And we will then be very happy to open the discussion and to engage with you on a number of questions that are emerging also for us within the framework of this research project. Well, as I said, we are a very large research project. We have actually, we are doing research with the same research questions in 9 different countries with 10 academic institutions and also a partner, an important partner for us with regard to disseminating our research findings among policymakers is ECLE, the International Network of Local Governments and Sustainability. So it's really also, it's key important to us is also to have an transdisciplinary approach and communicating our research findings to policymakers. And yes, maybe to give you a bit of a background, I mean, why are we actually analyzing these questions? Why do we have a project on housing inequalities and the relationship with environmental and energy policies? As you might all know, we have signed, most countries in Europe have signed the Paris Agreement, and with that there has been a commitment towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then with the European Green Deal, actually, there has been a very explicit commitment to become climate neutral by 2050. We know that the building sector is responsible for a very high amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is no surprise that the building sector is targeted very much with environmental and energy policies. And but what is very important here is, yes, while the policy goals are the same for all these countries, the implementation strategies are very different. And so we see that in these 9 countries, for example, the way we are operationalizing through specific projects and programs, this goal is very different. Moreover, also the context is very different. The socioeconomic context is very different. The housing regimes are very different, meaning that the same goal in different places has obviously very different repercussions. And this is a very critical concern to us. What, however, all these countries have in common is that we are increasingly talking about a housing crisis in Europe, and also about growing housing inequalities. So this is certainly a common denominator that all these countries have, increasing housing inequalities. And of course, there is an increasing concern and increasing awareness that somehow these housing inequalities are affected or being affected also by environmental and energy policies, and that there is a need to better understand the relationship between the two. So what are our research questions? Well, in a nutshell, we are actually looking at how green transition initiatives affect housing inequalities. And as I mentioned, what contextual factors, policies, housing and green transition initiatives, housing regimes, socioeconomic structures worsen or mitigate housing inequalities. Who is benefiting from energy refurbishment incentives? That's a very straightforward question. And then, of course, if and when housing inequalities emerge because of environmental and energy policies, what policy measures are actually required to mitigate these negative impacts? So what environmental and energy policy are we actually looking at? Well, first of all, we look at densification, and densification aims at promoting a more compact urban development to combat urban sprawl, which is considered one of the main causes for extreme soil consumption, loss of biodiversity, but also, of course, to high CO2 emissions and pollution related to traffic, transport systems, and the whole infrastructure that also has to be sprawled over a larger territory. So the discussion about the need of urban densification has been around for several decades, but now it is seen as part of this package of strategies to achieve the green transition. We are looking at energy refurbishments, which are the retrofitting of buildings, so which includes actually the building envelope, but also the engineering system, the heating system, ventilation, cooling, and so on. And we are looking also at nature-based solutions, which are understood actually as measures, imitations from the nature, or initiatives inspired by nature, driven by nature, to reduce, again, CO2 emissions, but also to promote biodiversity. So what housing inequality? So housing inequality is a concept that is not so easy to define. Even within our project, we are still a bit having discussions around that. But in a nutshell, we can say that housing inequalities refer to systemic disparities in access to adequate and affordable housing. What we mean by systemic disparities and what do we actually mean by affordable housing? I mean, this is actually an issue. We are concerned about the right to adequate housing and how this right to adequate housing is distributed among different segments of the population. So we know that factors that are triggering housing inequalities are, for instance, socioeconomic status, gender, ethnic background, migration background. So we see what is the differential access people have to adequate housing, where by adequate housing, we also refer to the definition of the adequate housing by the United Nations Commission for Economic, Cultural, and Social Affairs, which defines adequate housing as affordability, location, habitability, accessibility, cultural adequacy, and so forth. So these are a bit the indicators we are concretely also looking at when we try to understand what housing, inequalities are. Most importantly, also tenure security, and we will come back to that later. Now let's talk briefly about the context of Switzerland. Well, first of all, as you might know, Switzerland is a very small country. It has a big constraint in terms of buildable land. It's a very mountainous country, meaning that the topography itself creates a shortage of land, which means also that awareness about the need to densify, to reduce soil consumption has been there for a very long time. We also have in Switzerland a very rapid population growth. 84% of the people live in urban areas, but the population is also rapidly growing thanks to this very favorable economic situation, what one should say. The GNP per capita in Switzerland is over $92,000 per year, and it's one of the top 10 economies worldwide. But nevertheless, Switzerland is not exempt of poverty, and we see that actually currently about 8.2% of the Swiss population live in poverty. So we have a federalist structure and also a direct democracy, a very bottom-up democratic system, which also means that for us it has been particularly challenging to analyze environmental and energy policies because they vary tremendously across cantons and even municipalities, meaning that actually not only the socioeconomic, demographic, and topographic context varies significantly, but also the instruments to which environmental goals are being achieved. And which means that we had analyzing just the federal policy sometimes doesn't really tell you that much about what is going on at the local level. And the same is also with regard to the housing regime or the housing system, where we see that the conditions are extremely different in large cities, for instance, compared to smaller cities. And what is very special about Switzerland, and this is almost certainly unique in Europe, and I even was told that worldwide, Switzerland is the country with the lowest percentage of homeowners. It's really a country of renters. 38% of the households only own the dwelling in which they reside. And it has a very weak national housing policy. I mean, this situation is also the result of a weak housing policy because the state in Switzerland never really considered it a responsibility, or only during very short periods. When there was a major housing crisis after the First World War and after the Second World War, there has been a punctual intervention of the government, of the national government in the housing sector. But whenever this crisis was by and large over, the government withdrew, considering that the private sector is the best equipped to tackle the housing needs. And we see under such conditions that the majority of the housing stock is rental housing owned by private landlords. Currently, the majority of the housing stock is still owned by private individuals, but we see that actually the share of corporate owners of housing stock is rapidly increasing. And this is a matter that we are currently quite concerned in Switzerland, because private individuals, but especially corporate institutions, see housing as a commodified item, as a profit-gaining instrument. And only 5%, at the national level, only 5% of the housing stock is non-profit, meaning in Switzerland, in general, most of these 5% would be owned by housing cooperatives and to some extent by foundations and public housing. We will see more concretely that in some cities the situation is very different, but also because the national housing policy is very weak. And if at all, there is a housing policy that is made by municipalities or by the cantons, but mainly municipalities. We also have, and that is a matter of concern in a country where more than 60% of the people depend on rental housing, we have actually a very weak tenant protection. So we have seen adequate housing also entails, by definition, tenure security. Tenure security in Switzerland for more than 60% of the people is not ensured. What are the trends in housing inequality in Switzerland? Well, between 2000 and 2021, the prices of single houses increased by 80% and rents increased by 30%. So here we see already there is something happening in the housing sector that affects also, of course, the possibility of even middle-class people to access ownership of housing. Under the present price conditions, even for a middle-class family, it's almost an impossible ambition to ever become an owner of their own housing. But what is also equally concerning is that between 2012 and 2022, the share of housing costs in disposable income of homeowners decreased from 21% to 17%. At the same time, the housing costs of renters increased from an average of 34% to 40% of their disposable income. So here we see a very important indicator that shows this tremendous inequality of people who are able to own their house and people who have to rent. And again, I insist, it's more than 60% of the people. On average, housing costs amount to 20% of the disposable income, but they are above 30% for lower educated people. And lower education is, of course, a proxy indicator of socioeconomic status. Non-Swiss households and single-parent households are particularly affected by high housing costs. And again, here we see another important socioeconomic indicator that helps us to understand what housing inequalities mean within a society. So there are households that, based on their demographic condition, based on their ethnic background or migration background, based on their education, based on their income, are discriminated, have difficulties in accessing adequate and affordable housing. So now let's have a look at the environmental and energy policies in Switzerland. Well, first of all, in Switzerland, also like in Europe, the building sector is responsible for a great deal of CO2 emissions. It's said that 40% of the energy consumption is coming from the building sector and 1/3 of the CO2 emissions, so similar figures to the rest of Europe. But currently, actually, even 1 million houses have little or no insulation. So there is a great potential of saving energy or for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by energy refurbishments, and that has been recognized. And 60% of the buildings still are heated with fossil fuel or conventional electricity. This is why, based on this consideration, based on the great potential of the building sector to contribute to achieve the climate goals, the building program was established in Switzerland in 2010, which is actually a program by the national government, but co-financed by the cantons. So it's implemented by the cantons that provides subsidies for energy refurbishment and for the replacement of heatings. It's funded through a CO2 levy partly, but partly by the canton. So again, and whether the canton wants to join this program or not depends on the canton, but most cantons have joined the program. But what exact measures each canton finances within the framework of this program is pretty much left to the canton. So again, making comparability a bit difficult. What all cantons have in common is that the only criteria to allocate subsidies is the building, the technical criteria. There are no socioeconomic criteria or other to target, for instance, these subsidies to a particular segment of the population or to a particular segment of the housing sector. Subsidies, however, finance up to 50% of the refurbishment costs, depending on the canton and the municipality. So what have we seen at the national level? What have been the achievements and the challenges so far? Well, certainly we can see that there has been a significant reduction of energy consumption and CO2 emissions thanks to this building program, but there are equity considerations. First of all, of course, homeowners, and again, I insist, it's less than 40%. Homeowners have obviously benefited much more from this program than renters. And because to access subsidies, you have to own a house. And this has, to some extent, again, exacerbated the inequalities between homeowners and renters. But the next concern is that there is a so-called, and some evaluations have shown, there is a so-called deadweight effect, meaning that many people get subsidies even if they have planned the refurbishment even without subsidies. But what is more concern is actually that this value-enhancing measure that comes through energy refurbishments can be passed to tenants. So if the refurbishment costs increase the value of a property, and that allows the homeowner to increase the rent. So that rents have increased because of refurbishments. But in addition, many landlords actually consider it much more an advantage to evict the present tenants in order to be able to carry out these refurbishment works in an empty building, which is, of course, from an organizational point, much more easy, and also to be able to rent out their houses after to new tenants without having any link to the previous rent. So we see actually that evictions are a major consequence. Increases of housing prices are also a major consequence, and which also shows that actually this program is enhancing housing inequalities and causing weakening tenure security and increasing the costs of housing. When it comes to densification, well, it has been a major concern in Switzerland for many years, but it has become mandatory since 2014. There has been a revision of the Spatial Planning Act, and since then, actually, municipalities have to promote the inward development. So they are only able to include new land for building based on demographic projections. This means that the resource that has already been scarce is becoming even scarcer. Buildable land is becoming very scarce. And as a result, of course, the value of land is increasing tremendously. The pressure on the land is increasing tremendously. The incentives of homeowners to build more dense, but also more valuable housing is very high. And again, we have quite a number of negative impacts. The housing costs are increasing tremendously because of the densification is said. Again, it cannot be generalized, but we will see particularly in urban contexts that's the case. The owners of for-profit rental housing are the main beneficiaries of densification. There is a massive demolition of affordable housing currently going on, and there is also very clear evidences, as my colleague Hannah will tell you, based on our case studies, that vulnerable people are particularly affected by the results of densification and all the demolitions and displacement that it's causing. Now let's look at nature-based solution. This is actually a new field of research, but also the concept has appeared in Switzerland only very recently. And so far, there have been very weak national policy instruments to promote nature-based solutions. And based on that, also there is not high awareness of whether and how nature-based solution can cause inequalities. Again, the national government is basically leaving it to municipalities to whether and how to implement such measures. Accordingly, there is, let's say, we could not find so far any public debate nor secondary data showing any clear links between the implementation of nature-based solutions and housing inequalities. But as we will see, we have currently, there are things moving more rapidly, and we have identified a case that Hannah is also going to present, which clearly shows that nature-based solutions are a risk that should not be underestimated. So what are the emerging issues in Switzerland? Well, first of all, homeowners are disproportionately benefiting from environmental and energy policy. There is an increasing awareness and concern about the negative impacts of energy refurbishments and densification and related consequences with regard to densification and energy refurbishments, but much less awareness about nature-based solutions. There are so far no national policy instruments to mitigate the negative impacts of environmental and energy policies. And the impact of environmental energy policies varies very much across regions, depending on the local housing markets, on demographic factors, and so on. And we will see that in the case of Zurich very clearly. Most instruments to implement environmental and energy policies are actually exacerbating housing inequalities, and they are actually blind to the possible impacts on housing inequalities. And accordingly, there are absolutely no instruments whatsoever so far to mitigate the negative impact of these policies. This is a very general introduction. Now we will look at the specific cases that we have studied in the framework of our research project, and Hannah will bring you there. Thank you for your attention so far.
Thank you, Jennifer. So as Jennifer said, if we kind of transfer to Zurich or zoom in on Zurich, it's important to understand some specificities of the Zurich case that are slightly different from the Swiss average that Jennifer has just presented. So Zurich is Switzerland's largest city. It has 440,000 inhabitants roughly. And the most striking difference perhaps is the difference in the tenure structure in Zurich. In Zurich, only 8% of the dwellings are owner occupied. So it's very much a city of tenants, even more than Switzerland as a country. What's also different is that the city owns quite a large share of the rental apartments, which is also rather unusual in the Swiss context. And housing cooperatives and other non-profit housing providers also own a very large share of the dwellings in Zurich. It's probably not comparable to Vienna, but still in the Swiss context, it's a lot. So it's roughly 26% of the rental housing stock that belongs to non-profit housing providers and the city of Zurich as well. So they rent their apartments out at cost rent. And if we add some other non-profit housing providers that might not strictly adhere to the definition of cost rent by the city of Zurich, then it's even 29% of the housing stock that is decommodified. And because these non-profit houses or apartments are occupied by slightly larger households, it's about a third of the population of Zurich that lives in non-profit housing. And in fact, the city of Zurich has a policy. It wants to increase the share of non-profit housing in the city up to 1/3 of all rental houses, of all rental housing units. But it's very difficult, in fact, to do that in this market environment where the private companies and individuals also build a lot. So in order to increase the share of non-profit housing, we would have to build even more. What's also important to understand in the case of Zurich is the rent level. Zurich has a very heated housing market, a housing crisis even, and rents have gone up significantly in the last decades. In this map, you can see the canton of Zurich, and this dark blob there, that's the city of Zurich. So the rent per square meter per month has increased by 4.80 francs in the span of a decade. So that's roughly 20%, and it's between 2010 and 2020. It's pooled data, but it's roughly this time. And since 2020, it has increased even more. However, there are very large differences also between the two market segments of the non-profit housing market and the free market. So in housing cooperatives, rent is up to 40% lower than on the free market. So that's really quite significant. The rent increase that I just showed on the previous map has also affected the non-profit housing sector, but much less than in the free market. So this difference is actually even increasing. And so you can imagine that housing cooperatives and other non-profit housing providers are really an important factor, an important element of the housing system in Zurich. But you can also imagine that for all those that are looking for an apartment and that do not have the privilege of being able to rent in housing cooperatives, or that do not have a contract that dates from 20 years back when rents were still lower, it's a very tough situation. So this increasing rents and the moderate tenant protection that Jennifer already alluded to is really leading to a situation in Zurich where housing is so expensive that many people that look for a house or for an apartment face the choice of either accepting very high housing costs or moving out of the city. And Jennifer also has already mentioned that there's a lot of displacement going on, as a lot of affordable housing is demolished and replaced with newer construction that is more dense, but also more expensive. And in all of that leads to a lot of political mobilization as well, a lot of protest, as you can see, for example, in this image of a mass demonstration last April, I think it was. So now we can zoom in even more, and we will look now at these issues in more detail in two case studies. One of them is Altstetten, and there we have a particular focus on densification and renovation. And the other is Schwamendingen, where densification, of course, is also an issue, as it's a national policy. But we have also the effect of a nature-based solutions project, or that has some elements of nature-based solutions in it, that we are also going to look at. Let's move to Altstetten first. So the rent increase that affects the whole city of Zurich varies across the different neighborhoods, and Altstetten is really one of the neighborhoods where asking rents have increased most. Between 2040 and 2024, again measured in Swiss francs per square meters, the rents have increased by, the asking rents, I should say, so those that are asked at the beginning of a rental contract, have increased by 62% in Altstetten. And we'll see the reasons for this in the next slides. So Altstetten is quite a large neighborhood in Zurich with a population of roughly 36,000 people. And historically, it's not very dense, but it has been earmarked by the city of Zurich for densification. So the plan is to, yeah, that's visible. The plan is to have high-rise buildings along the train tracks here and to densify generally in all of the pink parts that you can see in this map. So these are some of the high-rise buildings. The specific ones are built and owned by the city of Zurich. So it's not only private development, but a lot of it is. And the thing is that densification in Altstetten kind of happened in a first phase, mostly on brownfield. And this sort of added residential capacity to the neighborhood without replacing existing housing. But now we've kind of entered a second phase, and there's really increasing pressure to renew and to densify existing housing. Because of the densification plans of the upzoning, also because of the refurbishment policies that make renovations more attractive, and first and foremost, I would say, because of the heated market. So in Zurich, almost any project that you do is profitable. So this leads to a lot of existing housing, mostly affordable housing, being demolished and replaced with new constructions. And just to give you an idea, in Altstetten alone in 2023, there were about 800 new apartments constructed, but at the same time, 300 were also demolished. And that usually looks something like this. So small and large buildings usually have these poles that indicate that something's going to happen. So in this case, it's either going to be demolished and be replaced, or a story is going to be added. And these poles are really everywhere if you walk through Altstetten. What you also see quite often, this is a typical example, you see the houses that are being demolished, and then on the right side, you see how they're replaced with a new construction. This is another example of the same thing. On the left, again, mostly affordable housing that's being demolished. And on the right side, you see it being replaced with a development. And in this case, it's designed by Herzog and de Meuron. So it's really sort of a luxury apartment. That's actually the finished project now. So this plot now is definitely more dense than it was before. But these are really luxury apartments. And that is also mirrored in the prices. And Jennifer made a screenshot of the asking rents in these apartments, and they're really incredibly high, even for Zurich. So here you have apartments of roughly 80 square meters, and depending a bit on which floor you're at, they're rented out for 3,600 francs and more. So at the moment, that's roughly 3,900 euros per month. So you can imagine that not a lot of people can actually afford that. And the demolitions and replacement constructions are really one of the main reasons why rents are increasing. And they, on the one hand, cause a lot of exclusionary displacement because prices are generally higher. So households with lower incomes find it more and more difficult to find housing in Altstetten and other parts in Zurich as well. But they also cause a lot of direct displacement, obviously, because if you think back of these 300 apartments that I mentioned that were demolished, that means obviously that 300 households had to move somewhere else. What's also a problem and also contributing to the rising rents is the renovations. And quite often renovations are also accompanied by cancellations of rental contracts. So that really adds to the problem. And between 2008 and 2016, about 35% of all the renovations in Altstetten included rental contract cancellations. And I'm sure this number hasn't gone down, if not up. In terms of ownership, that's also worth noting. So much of the new construction is done by institutional investors, so these corporate landlords, pension funds, banks, insurances, not only, but a lot of it. And there is also a lot of cooperative housing in Altstetten, or a fair amount at least. So it's about 20% of all the dwellings in the neighborhood. But it's generally perceived as not being enough to buffer the effect of the developments of everything that's happening around the housing cooperatives. So all of this displacement and the increase of rents, of course, has consequences for the people that used to live in Altstetten and now have to move out or find a different apartment. It affects their everyday life, it affects their social networks as well. And in our research, we've done a lot of interviews with people that live in the neighborhood that are active in the city or in NGOs, or there are other local stakeholders. And we have this quote from a representative of an Office for Urban Participation, and they also do activist work in Altstetten. And I quote, "In the 2 housing estates in Altstetten where I have worked, many people are affected by displacement. Many people who are affected by displacement are not only socially integrated in the neighborhood, but also work there. They are essential workers, working in hospitals, in cleaning, in logistics. These are people that the city needs in order to function. If you work shifts or at night, you can't just commute indefinitely." So it's really creating also more and more problems because people have to move out of the city. And another quote from a social worker working with youth shows what the consequences of this displacement are for these young people. I quote again, "Those who move out, it's not like they usually find something else within the neighborhood. Yes, they just have to leave the city. And for young people, this leads to a great deal of uncertainty because it's the age when you least want major changes in your social environment. You're rooted here and you have your circle of friends there." So it's really also in schools, we have had interviews with some people responsible for the schools, and they really say that it's actually, the displacement is at a scale where it's really also noticeable in schools. Right, let's move to Schwamendingen. Schwamendingen still has a lot of affordable housing, and also rather old housing. A lot of it dates from the time around the 1950s, where a lot of housing cooperatives built housing estates in Schwamendingen, and is old in that sense that it hasn't been really renovated or totally renovated since then. In Schwamendingen, there is also a high share of vulnerable households with below average incomes, a lot of elderly people as well, single parents, and the share of people without Swiss citizenship is also much higher in Schwamendingen than in the rest of the city. Housing cooperatives own 32% of all the dwellings in Schwamendingen, so this is really a considerable part and more than on average in the city. And what we're focusing on in Schwamendingen is this project that's called Einhausung Schwamendingen and Überland Park. So it's really a highway enclosure with a park on top. And a park on top can be considered as a nature-based solutions because it's also, it has lots of different plants and structures for wild bees, etc. So it's really promoting biodiversity as well as recreational facilities for the neighborhood. But I'm going to show you, I think it's easiest if I show you the picture of what this enclosure of the highway looks like. So it's really the highway, and then there's kind of a tunnel that has been built on top of the highway, a park on top of that tunnel, and below the highway you have the tram lines. It's quite an impressive project. I can show you a video. It's a drone flight above the project. It's about 1 kilometer long. And it's really interesting that, I mean, what you see now used to be the highway, and it really cut through the middle of the neighborhood. causing a lot of noise and air pollution. And already decades ago, the residents of this neighborhood demanded that the highway should be covered or put underground. And because of the trams, it wasn't possible to put it underground, so it was decided to cover it up. And it was actually a popular initiative that has been initiated by the residents of the neighborhood, and they won the popular vote, so it was really decided that this should be done. And then years of planning followed. It was a very complicated construction, and actually in the first phase of the project, it was planned to simply put some greenery on top of the tunnel. But then at a later phase, it was decided that it should really be a park that also serves as a connection in a way for the two sides of the neighborhood. So construction started in 2018, I think, and then in 2024, the highway reopened again, and last year in May, the park was inaugurated. Oops. Right. So the project was very well received by the population in a way. This is a picture of the day of the inauguration, and it's really also quite a busy place. At other times, the park has a lot of qualities for recreation, and the whole piece of infrastructure is certainly a massive improvement for the neighborhood. Right now, there's also some slightly awkward situations, or funny situations, because you see on the left some houses that really used to sit on top of the highway, and now they have a park right in front of them. And on the right-hand side, this situation of the houses is also slightly weird, because now they look at an 8-meter high wall, which is maybe better than looking at the highway, but it's still it has some strange situations as well. But what's most striking about the whole situation, and you can see that on the left as well, again, the poles that indicate there's going to be construction. And if you walk through the park right now, you really see a lot of these poles, a lot of cranes. So construction activity around the new project, around the enclosure, is very high. And this is also to do with the planning around the enclosure, because the city has come up with a design plan, a Gestaltungsplan, for the area around the enclosure. So for all of the plots of land that are on the left or on the right side of the park. And this plan allows for additional densification. If the building is connected with a bridge to the park, it allows for even more denser building. So the fact that now you're allowed to build much more on these plots of land, together with the fact that a lot of these housing estates are in a phase of their life cycle where they need renovation at least, leads to a situation where actually most of the landowners on the left and on the right of the enclosure have decided to demolish their buildings and to replace them with new constructions. So this looks something like this. These are still the old houses and the poles that indicate that there's going to be much more housing there. So in fact, a lot of the landowners on the left and on the right side of the enclosure are housing cooperatives. And even these housing cooperatives mostly rebuild their housing estates. And actually, when some first critiques of this planning document that foresaw this additional densification came up, the city argued that the social effects of these new buildings, of these reconstructions, wouldn't be that bad, because it's mostly housing cooperatives. And housing cooperatives usually find alternative solutions for their members if they have to move out of the estate because of the demolition. And housing cooperatives rent out at cost rent. So that was the argument, that it's not going to cause a lot of disruption in that sense. And this is true. It would certainly be worse if it was only private developers. But the thing is that even the new developments, even if they're built by housing cooperatives, it's much more expensive than the housing that used to be there previously. So even if the personal hardship for those people that have to move out is perhaps a bit less than in other situations, it's still changing the neighborhood in a way that it's going to be less affordable for a lot of households. For example, for this elderly couple that Jennifer overheard saying that actually they liked new development, but they could never afford to rent in the new buildings. So this emblematic project of the Einhausung Schwamendingen and the Überlandpark is really also one that, I wouldn't say it caused gentrification in Schwamendingen, but it has certainly helped and spurred the process. And those people, and that's perhaps most paradoxical, that those people that fought for the enclosure of the highway, those people that also endured the noise and the air pollution there, are now the ones who in most cases can't afford to live in Schwamendingen anymore. So to sum up, the highway enclosure has significantly increased the attractiveness of the neighborhood. So we observe rising rents and many renewal projects that lead to displacement. And there are a lot of housing cooperatives next to the enclosure. So to some extent, they perhaps reduce the personal hardship of the displacement a little bit, as they offer alternatives, but all of the renewal projects together still contribute to gentrification processes in Schwamendingen. And there is also the general concern that the city hasn't really done enough to kind of mitigate these effects. So we have interviewed a city official, and he says that this project, the Einhausung Schwamendingen, is exactly the kind of project that was carried out without considering the housing policy implications at all. Only at the end, under political pressure, did action begin, but it was simply too late. And that it's too late is kind of also confirmed by the interviews and the interviewees that say there's a lot of signs that already show this long-term change in the neighborhood that has started, but it is also certainly going to go on. So to quote a representative of a local NGO, I think it's a combination of such projects as the enclosure, but also of the estates that are being demolished, the new buildings that are going up, the housing that is becoming more expensive, and the different people who move in. Because different people are already living in Schwamendingen now, and it will definitely continue to change. Because of this, I can well imagine that the pressure on people affected by poverty will increase even further. Right. So that has been a small tour of Altstetten and Schwamendingen. And for the last slide, I will hand back to Jennifer for the discussion.
Well, I think it's basically, I would like to open the discussion. I mean, we have heard the title of this small symposium is also how can we actually refers to this tension between environmental policies and social needs. And certainly one question is how, I mean, I think it would be nice to further discuss with you, can we actually, what measures are required to reduce this tension, to mitigate these tensions, or to align social development with environmental development? Is it necessary that environmental goals and social equity are mutually exclusive? And I think it would be great if we could participate in this discussion. How can we actually align these two very important goals? We are also interested to learn, maybe by discussing with you, what are actually what is special about Switzerland in comparison to other countries? What can we learn from other European Union countries? Have there been cases already where mitigation measures have been identified? Can those more measures be also relevant for Switzerland? What can we in Switzerland learn from other countries? Because we certainly see, and you have seen it here, I think these cases are really very emblematic, that the problems are serious. It's not just some externalities of, by and large, a very good projects. Yes, the projects are good, the intentions are very good, but the social risks are really far from being irrelevant. And then, of course, the question is, I mean, is the problem really environmental and energy policies, or is it something else? Is the financialization of the housing market really the problem? And whatever happens within these highly financialized housing markets is bound to go the wrong way. The other questions where we see in Switzerland, in Zurich in particular, we have a strong housing policy compared to other places of Switzerland. We have a very strong housing cooperative sector, and that gave to some extent to the city also the confidence that where you have a high share of non-profit housing, of decommodified housing, that is enough to sort of mitigate the risks of environmental and energy policies. But we have seen now that that's maybe not enough. And maybe again, to remind you that the large number of people depend from the private rental market, it shows that it's not just a matter of increasing the non-profit housing stock, but also to further protect the tenants that rely on the private rental market, and how can we actually achieve that goal. And so finally, yes, back to the first question, how can we actually reconcile social and environmental goals? And I would like to stop here, and I don't know, Anna, whether you want to add something, or otherwise simply to open the discussion and sharing with you, also hear from you your experience. Thank you very much for your attention.